afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and whenever you're listening. I'm Jeremiah Ridge, and this is American Reckoning podcast, where faith leads, history speaks, and truth and the light will endure. Today is March 20th, 2026. Today's episode will be pretty long and two separate podcasts, and for both your sake and mine, I'll release them in two different podcasts. In between parts, I'll catch my breath and load up on some more caffeine and nicotine. Now, before we get into this, let me say something plain and straight. What you're about to hear, you're not going to hear it taught like this in a high school classroom. Not this direct, blunt, and not without a little polish on it. Now, truth be told, it'll probably wouldn't get a teacher fired, but I'd bet good money that they'd be told real quick to rein it in, tone it down, and take the edge off. And we're not going to do that here today. So I want you to picture this, particularly if you're one of my old former students. You're sitting in a class, same old desk, same old lesson, but instead of reading from the book, teacher just kind of leans back, takes a breath, and decides to tell it to you straight. No filter. Just the truth. They've seen it, and that's what you're going to get here today. Because here's the deal: when it comes to history and civics in this country, the goal isn't really critical thinking and deep, uncomfortable truths. Not most of the time. The goal is patriotism, nationalism, build a sense of national pride and shared identity. And look, I'm proud of my country, and I mean that. But if we're being honest, that's about where the real investment in teaching history usually stops with our government. And that right there, that matters more than people realize. I believe this country has not yet reached or lived up to the promise and potential laid out in our founding documents. And if we're ever going to be move closer to that promise, then we have to be willing to teach history accurately, not selectively, not sentimentally, and not as propaganda for one party or one ideology or strictly just promote nationalism and pride, but honestly, with enough courage to acknowledge both our achievements and our failures. Because if we, as a people and a nation, cannot tell itself the truth about its past, we will struggle to act wisely in the present. And right now, the present is serious. We're now entering the third week of what is, in practical terms, a war involving the United States, Iran, and Israel. American forces are actively engaged. We have thousands of U.S. servicemen and women deployed across the region on Navy ships in contested waters and on bases in Iraq, Syria, and throughout the Gulf region, operating in an environment where they're at real and immediate risk. The United States is not just observing events. We are participating in military operations against Iranian targets and against a very uh, entrenched regime. And as with any conflict, there's already been casualties involving American service members and innocent civilians across the region, including in Iran. So this is not a theoretical. This is not abstract. This is war. And as this conflict is developed, a serious debate has emerged in Washington. Members of Congress, primarily Democrats, but also some Republicans, have raised concerns that the U.S. involvement may be unconstitutional, arguing that Congress has not formally authorized the use of military forces. Others, primarily Republicans, argue that the president has authority to act, particularly when American forces are at risk or when rapid decisions are required. At the same time, most Republican leadership has backed the president's actions and has not moved to block or significantly challenge the use of force. Recent votes in Congress give a clearer picture of where lawmakers stand. And the Senate, on March 4th, a resolution to require congressional approval for continued military action against Iran failed 53 to 47, almost entirely along party lines, with only one Republican, Paul Ryan, voting in favor. And in the House on March 5th, a similar effort failed 219 to 212. More than 200 Democrats voted to limit the president's authority, while 200 Republicans voted to support it, highlighting a sharp divide in Congress with only a small number of lawmakers on both sides crossing party lines. And all this unfolding in front of the American public that is, in many ways, war weary. After more than 20 years of conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's a deep fatigue in the cost of blood and treasure. There's also concerns at home. Rising fuel prices, the cost of everyday essentials that is likely going to come with those increased fuel costs. Many Americans households are still struggling with ongoing inflation, and a growing sense among many Americans that they've seen this pattern before that has called our nation to war. Vietnam, where the Gulf Tonkin incident was later called into question. Iraq, where weapons of mass destruction were never found. And now, in this moment, inconsistent explanations from President Trump and the Trump administration about why the United States has taken military action against Iran. These reasons have ranged from protecting U.S. forces in the area to countering Iran's nuclear capability and their growing missile stock to broader strategic goals to include regime change. Those explanations haven't always been aligned, even in any particular given day, and that's added to some public skepticism. So this debate isn't just about law or politics, it's about trust. It raises a deeper question, not just whether the United States should be involved, but who gets to decide now and in the future, because this is not a new argument. It's one that has surfaced repeatedly throughout American history, especially in moments like this. So in this episode, we're going to walk through that history, starting with the Constitution divides war power between Congress and the president, then moving through the Gulf Tonkin resolutions in Vietnam, the War Powers Resolution of 1973, the authorization for the use of military force after September 11, 2001, and how those decisions shape the system we're operating under today. Then we'll come back to the present, looking at the what U.S. leaders have said over the past several days, the reason behind the current conflict, the concerns being raised in Congress, and why the American public is responding the way it is. And finally, we'll look at the question of accountability. What does the president owe the country in a time of war? What is Congress supposed to do? And what the American people should expect from both? Because at the end of the day, this isn't about policy. It's about responsibility. And it's about the most serious decision nation can make, and that's going to war. To understand where we are right now, with American forces actively engaged, with servicemen, men and women in harm's way, we have to go back to how this system was designed. The Constitution divides war powers between Congress and the President. Under Article 1, Congress has the authority to declare war. Under Article 2, the President serves as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. This structure was intentional. At the Constitutional Convention, the framers were not focused on any single issue. They were debating representation, taxation, federal authority, the scope of executive power. One of those issues was going to war. War powers were part of that larger concern. How do you prevent too much power from being concentrated in one person? Many of those founders had just fought a war against the king who could take a nation into a conflict without any meaningful restraint. And so they made a deliberate choice. The power to take a country to war should not belong to a single individual. It will require deliberation. It will require Congress. James Madison argued that the executive branch was the most prone to war. So the Constitution was designed to slow that decision down. But the system also recognized reality. Presidents have always had the authority to respond to immediate threats, to defend American forces, and to act when time does not allow for extended debate. And that tension between speed and deliberation, between executive action and congressional authority, has defined American war powers from the beginning. And it's exactly the tension that we're seeing playing out right now. Because the question today is not just what the Constitution says, but how that authority has actually been used. The first major modern example of this tension comes in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin. But U.S. involvement in Vietnam did not begin there with that incident. It had been building for years. Under President Dwight Eisenhower, the United States had roughly 700 military advisors in South Vietnam by the late 50s, primarily supporting and training South Vietnamese forces. Under President John F. Kennedy, that number increased significantly, rising to more than 16,000 U.S. military personnel by 1963. At that stage, the mission was still officially described as advisory. But in reality, many of those advisors were already operating in combat environments, accompanying South Vietnamese units on missions, calling in air support, and in some cases directly engaging in combat. So even before the Gulf of Tonkin, the United States was already deeply involved. Then came August 1964. U.S. Navy destroyers USS Maddox and later the USS Turner Joy were operating off the coast of North Vietnam. On August 2nd, the Maddox was involved in a confirmed engagement with North Vietnamese patrol boats. 2 days later, on August 4th, reports came in of a second attack. The second incident is where the controversy begins. At the time, those reports were presented to Congress as evidence of continued aggression. And on August 7th, 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and the vote was overwhelming. The House voted unanimously 416 to 0, and the Senate 88 to 2 to authorize President Johnson to take all necessary measures to repel attacks and prevent further aggression. There is no formal declaration of war, but in practice, it gave the president broad authority to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And over time, questions began to emerge about the second reported attack on August 4th. Declassified intelligence, internal communications, and later historical reviews indicated that the incident was likely a misinterpretation of the radar and sonar data, influenced by bad weather, confusion, and as often, the fog of war. Even some officials involved at the time later acknowledged uncertainty about whether the second attack actually occurred. But by the time those doubts surfaced, the United States was already deeply committed. What followed was a steady escalation from thousands of advisors already engaged alongside South Vietnamese forces to a full-scale war with more than 500,000 American troops deployed at its peak. And on the battlefield, American forces were often highly effective. U.S. servicemen and women won engagements, cleared territory, and carried out complex operations with precision and discipline. But success on the battlefield did not translate into overall success, because while battles were being won overseas, the war is increasingly being lost at home. Public support began to collapse. Several factors drove this shift. Rising casualties in the draft brought the war into American households. Television coverage, which showed the brutal realities of combat, the credibility gap, a growing belief that the official statements did not match the conditions on the ground. Then came a major turning point, the Tet Offensive in 1968. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched widespread attacks across South Vietnam, including major cities. From a military standpoint, the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces repelled the offensive and inflicted very heavy losses. But strategically, the impact was different, and the scale and the coordination of those attacks contradicted the repeated assurances from the U.S. government that the enemy is weakening. For many Americans, it raised a fundamental question. If we're winning, what the heck just happened? Around the same time, influential journalists began publicly expressing doubt. Most notably, Walter Cronkite, one of the most trusted voices in American media, concluded after visiting Vietnam that the war was unlikely to end with a clear victory. That moment carried significant weight with the public because Vietnam was not just being fought on the battlefield, it was being fought in American living rooms, and trust was eroding. That erosion deepened with revelations like the Pentagon Papers, which showed internal doubts even within the government leadership about the war's progress and strategy. For many Americans, Vietnam was not just a military conflict, but a crisis in trust. And over time, a broader conclusion took hold. Despite the effectiveness and sacrifice of American troops, the war itself had been mismanaged by the highest levels at our senior military leadership and our political leadership. Military strategy and civilian leadership failed to translate battlefield success into sustainable outcomes. And in the end, the failure cost the United States the war. That experience left a lasting impact on Congress because lawmakers began to recognize something critical. They had granted broad authority to the executive branch without clear limits and without sufficient oversight, and the realization is what led to the next major attempt to rebalance power. By the early 1970s, the Vietnam War had exposed a growing problem. The balance of war powers and vision and the Constitution had shifted in practice. Congress had authorized force broadly through the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, but had limited visibility into how that authority is being used. And in some cases, military actions were taken without clear public disclosure or congressional approval. One of the most significant examples came under President Richard Nixon. Began in 1969, the United States conducted a series of secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia, followed by expanded ground military operations in both Cambodia and Laos. These actions were aimed to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines and sanctuaries along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but they were carried out with limited transparency. Many members of Congress and much of the American public were not fully aware of the scope of these operations at the time they were taking place. This raised some serious constitutional concerns because while U.S. forces were expanding military operations into additional countries, there had been no new congressional authorization specifically approving those actions. And when those operations became public, they intensified an already growing crisis of trust. For many in Congress, this confirmed a broader pattern that presidents could and would expand military conflict beyond what had originally been authorized, and that Congress lacked effective tools to restrain the expansion in real time. So Congress moved to act. In 1973, over President Nixon's veto, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution. The goal was clear: to reassert congressional authority over decisions of war. That law requires that the president must notify Congress within 48 hours of introducing U.S. forces into hostilities. If Congress does not approve, military action must end within 60 days unless Congress authorizes it. If Congress does not authorize it, A 30-day withdrawal period is allowed if needed. On paper, it was a direct response to Vietnam and to the actions like that took place in Cambodia and Laos, an attempt to assure future military engagements could not expand without congressional oversight. But in practice, its effectiveness has been limited. Presidents from both parties have consistently questioned whether the War Powers Resolution is constitutional, particularly the requirement to withdraw forces without congressional approval. While most administrations have complied with the notification requirements, they have often interpreted the law in ways that preserve broad executive flexibility. And over time, that has led to a system where Congress retains formal authority, but the president often controls the timing, scope, the initial decision to use force, which brings us directly into the modern era, because the framework created after Vietnam is the same framework still being used today. The War Powers Resolution was intended to restore the balance between Congress and the president. But in the decades that followed, presidents from both parties continued to use military force without formal declarations of war by Congress. During the 1980s and 90s, the United States was involved in multiple military operations, often justified as limited, defensive, or in the national interest, but not formal declared wars. Under Ronald Reagan, U.S. forces were deployed to Lebanon in 1982 as part of a multinational peacekeeping mission during the country's civil war. That mission later resulted in the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing, where 241 American Marines were killed. In 1986, the United States conducted airstrikes against Libya, targeting facilities linked to Muammar Gaddafi in response to terrorist attacks tied to Libyan intelligence. Under George H.W. Bush, the United States launched Operation Just Cause in Panama in 1989, a rapid military intervention to remove General Manuel Noriega, who had just been indicted on drug trafficking charges and was accused of threatening U.S. interests. Sounds pretty close to what happened in Venezuela with what's his face. In 1991, the U.S. led a coalition in Gulf War following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Congress authorized the use of force, but it was still not a formal declaration of war. Under Bill Clinton, the U.S. conducted air operations in Bosnia in 1995 as part of NATO's effort to stop ethnic violence during the breakup of Yugoslavia. In 1999, the United States carried out extended air campaign in Kosovo, also under NATO without explicit congressional authorization, aimed at halting Serbian military actions against ethnic Albanians. And in 1998, the U.S. launched missile strikes in Afghanistan and Sudan in response to bombings of the U.S. embassies in East Africa targeting suspected terrorist facilities. In each of these cases, the president acted, sometimes with congressional support, sometimes with limited authorization, and sometimes without clear approval at all. But the pattern was consistent. Military force was being used without formal declarations of war. Now, it's important to understand this debate over presidential war powers did not suddenly appear today. There is opposition in Congress during these years. Lawmakers raised concerns about executive overreach in places in conflicts such as Lebanon, Libya, and Kosovo. And in some of those cases, argued that the presidents were acting without proper constitutional authority. But those debates looked much different than they do today. They were less constant, less visible to the public, often less politically entrenched. Much of the disagreement happened through hearings, internal debates, and limited public coverage, not through the kind of immediate 24-hour political and media response we see now. And there was another pattern that also existed, one that still feels familiar today. Members of Congress would raise constitutional concerns, but not always take decisive action to stop the operations. Funding would continue, operations would move forward. So while there is real concern about executive power, there is also inconsistency in how those concerns were acted upon. And that brings us to an important shift, because by the end of the 1990s, the question was no longer whether presidents could use military force without the declaration of a war that had already been established in practice. The real question had become, how far could that authority go? And that question would be answered very quickly in the aftermath of the next major event. This is end of part one of episode 2 regarding Iran. Please join me for part 2 as we discuss the last 25 years of the expansion of war powers after 9/11 to present day and the growing hyperpartisanship and hypocrisy in D.C. Please keep our servicemen men and women in your prayers and pray that our leaders in D.C. had the wisdom, clarity, and courage to do what's right. Until our next conversation, I'm Jeremiah Ridge, and this has been the American Reckoning podcast, where faith leads, history speaks, and truth and light will endure.